So as we start thinking about this question about economic development and growth, it's important to lay some foundational pieces. And so what we'll do here is talk a little bit about this idea of growth, different ways of thinking about growth, and then we'll sort of set things up for the next conversation. When we talk about economic development, we tend to focus on this idea of GDP. So GDP is gross domestic product, gross being the sum total, domestic being within your country, and product being what you're producing. So the sum total of everything you're producing in your country in a given year is your gross domestic product, is your GDP. So the US cranks out 16 to 17 trillion dollars worth of stuff. I think the global GDP is something like 60 something trillion dollars every single year. And the idea is that if that number goes up, if you're cranking out more stuff, then you have economic growth. So how do you get economic growth? How do you get that GDP number to increase? Well, one way to do that is to focus on expanding your population. If you have more people cranking out more stuff, you're going to crank out more stuff. Certainly when we look at the numbers, countries with larger populations have typically larger GDPs on average than countries with smaller populations. That having been said, simply ramping up your population might not be the easiest way to get economic growth, and it might not be the kind of economic growth that you want, because lots of people cranking out stuff with shovels and rudimentary tools is maybe not as good of a scenario as a few people cranking out the same amount of stuff using more sophisticated tools, tractors, and that sort of a thing. So rather than simply increasing your GDP, maybe you want to increase how much each person is cranking out so you get more GDP even if your population is staying the same. So that's a conversation about increasing the efficiency of your population. And that tends to be what we focus on a lot, rather than just simply cranking up population numbers. So one way to increase the efficiency of your population is technology, right? So lots of people trying to cultivate land with shovels and hand tools are not going to do a whole lot of land cultivation. One person using a tractor can cultivate way more land and is going to be more efficient, more productive, can crank out more GDP. So pairing people up with technology is one useful way to do that. Another is to build skills, right? And so if you have to type a paper and you're hunting and pecking and trying to figure out where things are on the keyboard, you're going to be fairly slow. If you're trained, if you have the ability to use all 10 fingers in typing, you're going to be much faster, right? So education tends to increase efficiency, increase productivity. That's one of the things that we look for in education. And then finally, we'll think about organization. And so if we had a company that was building cars, and we had a group of people, and we had a pile of tools and a pile of parts, and we all just sort of grabbed a tool and grabbed a part and tried to figure out where things went, that would be a very inefficient, borderline stupid way to build a car. Right? Nobody builds cars that way. Instead, they take all the people, they give each person a tool, they line them up, they give them a pile of one part behind them, and you get a conveyor belt that sort of moves the car along. And so I take my one tool, my one part, and I put it in one spot, and I do the thing with the bolts, and the piece stays and it moves on. And so there's no time lost searching for parts and searching for tools and learning where things go. It's all very routinized, and that makes for a much more efficient way of producing that same product. So you can think about how to get people to be more efficient, and there are certainly things that you can do, but there's also ways to make your economy as a whole more efficient. One of those ways is the idea of finding your comparative advantage, and we're going to talk a lot about comparative advantage when we talk about trade. So I'm just going to put that one on hold for right now, but the short version is that you're going to find the contribution you can make to the global economy that allows for you to use your talents in the most efficient way, considering what everybody else is good at, what everybody else can produce. And so the idea is that if we all find our appropriate niche in the global economy, collectively we're going to be cranking out more stuff. And again, we're going to talk way more about that in greater detail. A second way to make your economy more efficient is to reduce constraints on businesses. So a number of years ago, I had way more work than I could handle during a summer, and so I hired my fiance at the time to subcontract out and work on a project for me. My father's a tax investigator, however, and so when he heard that I had this sort of scheme cooked up, he said, well, you're obviously going to, file paperwork with the IRS and do unemployment insurance and all that. I said, oh, absolutely, Dad. Of course, everything will be above board. And so I went to the IRS website and I got my employer identification number, and I found there was a link on the IRS website that said, hiring your first employee. And I'm like, yes, I'm hiring my first employee. And I clicked on it and it said, don't. It said, don't do it. If there's anything you can do to avoid crossing that threshold, do it. If you can work longer hours yourself, if you can not take on more work, if you can press small children into service, do whatever you have to do, because as soon as you cross that line, as soon as you hire your first employee, there's going to be a lot of paperwork. There's going to be state level paperwork, there's going to be federal paperwork, there's going to be quarterly reports. There's a lot to keep track of. Know what you're getting into. I thought, this will be fine. You know, I'm a smart guy. I'm good with Excel. This won't be a problem. And I got to tell you, one of the happiest days of my life was when I fired my fiance, because it was really onerous. Now, there have been studies that have looked into this. In fact, there was a famous study by a Peruvian economist, Hernando de Soto, where he had a graduate level class in econ, and he was interested in sort of what it takes to start businesses in Peru. And so he sent his graduate students out to start a simple business in Peru. And initially they were very optimistic and they thought they'd have it done like that afternoon. And he said, no paying bribes. You are going to stand in line, you're going to get all the forms processed and all the stamps you need. Let's do this above board. And they sort of frowned at him, and the entire class working together for the entire semester couldn't get a business started legally. And Hernando de Soto said, and that's a problem. And so that experience of Hernando de Soto and his class led to the World Bank tracking how long it takes in terms of bureaucracy to set up a business in countries around the world. And what they found is if you want to set, I think it's like an import-export business in the United States, you should expect to spend 5 full days doing paperwork. 5 days of lost productivity just to get the forms stamped and licenses in place. Now, that might seem like a lot. The global average is 50. 50 days of standing in line and doing paperwork. And so the idea is if you can push that number down a little bit, that's going to be time that people can spend doing actual productive business-like activities rather than standing in line trying to get paperwork signed. So reducing some of those restraints on business can help make things more efficient. It can allow for easier entry into the private sector. A final way that you can go about making your economy more efficient is to make transactions transparent and predictable. Transactions are economist speak for buying and selling. What does that mean, transparent and predictable? Well, I'm guessing most of you have the experience of going and filling up your tank with gas for your car. And so you put the handle in the thing and gas goes into the gas tank and the numbers whir on the machine and you see them go up and it says, okay, you just pumped 10 gallons of gas and it's, $30 is what you owe. And so you just pay it. Have you ever stopped to think for a second, how do you actually know that the machine gave you $10 or 10 gallons worth of gas? It says it, but how do you know? How do you know it's not 9.5 gallons? Well, we could live our lives constantly double checking to make sure we're not cheated. We could bring a gallon jug, right, and fill up a gallon of gas in that gallon jug and then siphon that into the gas tank and do that 10 times. And that would make sure that we're getting what we're supposed to. And that's a very inefficient way to go about and conduct transactions, to do business. And so there is a agency with the state of North Dakota, and every state has these, Department of Weights and Measures, that's job it is to go around and check the machines, right? They check the machines and they have that gallon jug and they do it and they check, okay, it says it's giving 1 gallon of gas, it's giving 1 gallon of gas. And they put a little sticker on the machine that says we checked it at this date and at this time and it reads appropriately. And because of that, we can just sort of go through life blithely assuming that the machine gives us the right number because one person is going around checking those machines and allowing for the rest of us to sort of just live our lives. And so that's another example of how you can make economic activity in your economy more efficient by reducing all of the headaches that would have to go with all that checking on an individual level. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how to ramp up that GDP. It's also worth talking about this difference in terms of how we think about economic growth and what's behind economic growth. And so you might have heard this idea of supply and demand. And we can sort of think about economic growth as a function of demand and supply, right? And so we could talk about internally driven growth, right? Where there's all of these factories that are out there and they have to choose how much they crank out. And whether they run 2 shifts or 3 shifts or 1 shift, And the driving factor about how much those factories are going to crank out is how much will people consume, the demand for goods. And so if you want factories to crank out more stuff, you've got to get people to consume more stuff, right? This idea that consumption is the driver of economic growth, and the key constraint on getting your factories to crank out more stuff is getting people to buy that stuff. And this is something that is often described as Keynesian economics, named after the British economist Keynes, who argued that when you have an economic recession, when people aren't consuming, that the government can step in and say, hell, we'll just buy stuff. And if the government is buying and buying and buying during economic recession, then those factories can continue to crank out stuff because there's demand. The government's propping up that demand. Factories continue to produce, and all of a sudden you've got people being hired, and all of a sudden economic prosperity is returning. Okay, so Keynesian economics is about propping up that demand side and keeping that demand, that consumption going and growing. A second way of thinking about economic growth, and one that we use probably more when we're talking about development in the context of developing countries, is this idea of sort of externally driven growth, right? There's this idea that if you can just produce it, somebody will buy it. There's an infinite, export market that you can sell to. Somebody wants that stuff somewhere. And therefore, we're thinking not about how to get people to buy more, but how to be able to make your economy produce more stuff. And so thinking about what are those constraints that might prevent people from building factories, from running additional shifts or expanding their businesses. You're thinking about the constraints on growth, those regulations or taxes or property rights, contract law, any of those things that we've talked about briefly so far could be things that you might want to focus on, that we would sort of lump into supply, right? Getting businesses to be able to produce more because somebody wants the stuff. And as I said, most theories and approaches to thinking about economic development tend to take this assumption, right? That if poor countries can just crank out more stuff, rich countries will buy it, they'll be cost competitive, and they can make sure that it'll go. The real constraint is getting factories to set up shop in poor countries so they can crank stuff out. Okay, and a final sort of foundational piece to think about, now that we've talked about sort of how you get economic growth, how you think about the demand and supply side, and finally, when we talk about policy, when we're talking about policy, there are different goals that we might have for economic policy. Oftentimes, we focus on this idea of economic prosperity, of getting that GDP number to go up, of getting standards of living to increase, or the GDP per capita number to go up, keeping unemployment low. All of that's good, and certainly if you're thinking in terms of economic liberalism, those are the metrics you want to aim for. But if you're taking maybe an economic nationalist perspective, sure, those are nice, but you also want to make sure that you have a strong base of military power. So you want to make sure that economic activity is centered on your steel industry or your computer industry or your space industry. You want to be building industries in specific areas that are going to give you a solid foundation for modern warfare. And that's a different kind of approach, and that might mean doing things that are maybe not economically efficient, that might not be as good for that overall economic prosperity. And then a final goal that some theories approach, economic nationalism or mercantilism sometimes take this view. Marxist theory, which we'll talk about next week, has an argument to be made for this idea of full or limited autarky, which is basically that your economy is self-sufficient. Now, in practical terms, that's really, really difficult to do. We're in a very interconnected world, but you do regularly see calls by policymakers for things like energy independence, right? That reliance upon foreign energy means that that's a vulnerable choke point in your economy that could be manipulated. It would be very difficult to replace or to adjust to. Similarly, you'll see states say that we should make sure that we have the ability to feed ourselves and that our agricultural industry can produce enough food for our own population. That would be another example of saying, for reasons of national security, for reasons of economic independence, we want to make sure that we're self-sufficient in these specific industries.